Well, hello, everybody. Hello. I'm so happy to see everybody here. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come so we can share with you. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to share some exciting information. So I am going to be talking to you about one individual in particular, but you'll hear about other individuals as well. So with that, my name is Joy Young, and as Leslie said, I'm a volunteer at the Birmingham Museum. My role is genealogy researcher and cultural consultant. I don't know that I'm so much of an expert, but I think the more I do this, I'll become more expert. I came to the museum as a result of taking a tour through West Bloomfield, where I live, and to the museum. And when I left there, my jaw was on the ground. I was like, oh my gosh, this is just amazing information. And I left there saying, who knew? So I love to say who knew. You're going to hear me saying that a lot tonight. So my topic tonight is going to be on John Selah Martin, who was a freedom seeker and an abolitionist, and how his life unfolded, and then we'll talk a little bit about how he engaged here in Southfield. The first thing I'd like to do is give thanks to R.J.M. Blackett. R.J.M. Blackett wrote a book, and it was called Beating Against the Barriers, The Lives of 6 19th Century African Americans. And one chapter in particular was The Lion from the West, the biography of John Selah Martin. Now, I will be using different iterations of John's name. His name is John Selah Martin. I'll be calling him J. Selah, Selah, Martin, John Martin. You may hear me say however many things, but that's who we're talking about. I'll sometimes be using the vernacular of his day. Many of the words are obsolete now, and they may actually be offensive. So please be aware that there is no offense intended. As we're adults here, and most of us or all of us have heard about American slavery, I just want to warn you that some of the information might be disturbing. Okay. So I want you to think about this. What if you discovered you had an ancestor, one that was born almost 200 years ago, and you found out about this ancestor and you said, you know, I would love to have a cup of coffee or tea and sit with them and hear their story. And once they told their story and you dried your tears, the next thing you said was, who knew? So who was John Selah Martin? I'm going to put this here because I'm going to use it a lot. So this is called John Selah Martin Back in the Light. Who was John Selah Martin? He was a man of many talents. From my research, I found out he was a man of faith, a pastor, an abolitionist, a leader, a statesman, a civil servant, an orator, a family man, a politician, an editor, taught himself to read and write. He was an overcomer. He was a dreamer of freedom for himself and others in slavery. He was a revolutionary and a free thinker, well-read and sociable. He showed great courage in his pursuits, and many think he was handsome. He was well-dressed from what we can see in the picture, and with his charismatic charm and determination, and against great odds, he succeeded at just about everything he put his mind to. From my readings, he could also be humble, but impatient and obstinate as well. And he was very driven. I think you'll see that tonight. He was a gentleman. Multitudes admired him and spoke highly of him. He was comfortable with many different cultures. He was a published poet, and he was a writer. He was well-traveled. John Selah Martin, though small of stature at 5 feet 8.5 inches, was a giant of a man during the time of slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. With all of these accolades, he was not perfect, which you shall see. And though he overcame much sorrow and difficulty, his life ended tragically and too soon. Some of you might need to get out tissues, I'm not sure, but we'll see. I could talk here for hours. I only have a few minutes or 40 minutes. I'm going to give you as much as I can, but his story is way bigger than this. But I want to give you some highlights. The fact that he and his story are so unknown was a real surprise to me. I had never heard of him until I read one sentence at the Birmingham Museum that got me started exploring his life. He was well known as an adult in England, in Scotland, and even he went to Switzerland, so you hear about that. He worked tirelessly with many anti-slavery societies to raise funding for the enslaved in antebellum America. My desire is to bring him back into the light, where his accomplishments, who he was as a person, and even his trials and tragedies will be made known to you. We must know him. We must know him. He is an integral part of African American, American, and world history. And like his contemporaries, the famous Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist and martyr John Brown, the first Black Senator Hiram Revels, and the first Black Governor PBS Pinchback, John Seller Martin must also be known. Enslavement, discrimination, oppression. He took these negative experiences and he translated them into a shared humanity that won him close fellowship and partnership with a great many people, groups, and colleagues, both Black and white, that fought for freedom and equality for enslaved Americans. So who was John Seller Martin? A correspondent in Massachusetts wrote, let's get him on there. Okay, I went too far. Let me go back a little bit. Okay, there we go. A correspondent from Lawrence, Massachusetts wrote in 1859, when John Seller was 27 years old, that he was, and this is a very long sentence, but think about what this correspondent is saying about him. He was one of those self-made men who, by the inherent force of native ability and strength of character, have risen above their surroundings and will make a broad and noble mark upon the record of the future as one of the brightest intellects and whose success is only equaled by his merit and genius. Who knew? I know a couple of you did know because I've talked to you already about it. Okay. So I'm going to read a quote from John Seller Martin. He says, "I hold that is a false logic which talks about good slaveholders. It is folly for us to talk about the slaveholders being kind. Cruelty is part and parcel of the system. If slavery is right at all, then all of its terrors and horrors, the whip, the manacle, the thumbscrew, the paddle, the gibbet, the stake, are right also. If it's not right, then all of these are wrong." And this was J. Seller Martin, and about 4,000 African Americans and abolitionists had gathered outside and inside the famous Tremont Temple in Boston, Massachusetts. And he gave this speech on a day of mourning to honor the martyrdom of the abolition John Brown, the martyr and abolitionist John Brown, and to call for further action to advance the abolitionist cause. So now we're going to talk about his early life in slavery. John Seller Martin was born in Charlotte, North Carolina in September of 1832. He was born into slavery to his mother, Winifred, also called Winnie, who was enslaved by a Mrs. Henderson, and they lived on her plantation. In J. Seller's autobiography, he tells us that Mrs. Henderson had a nephew, Mr. Martin, who was to marry an heiress when she came of age. In the meantime, Mrs. Henderson wanted to distract her nephew to keep him away from not quite so wealthy white women who could interfere with her plans. She forced Winifred into a relationship with Mr. Martin. When he showed no interest in the heiress, but only in Winifred and his 2 children with her, she sent him to Virginia to manage her estates. While he was gone, Mrs. Henderson sold Winifred, John Seller, and his older sister Caroline, both of these Mr. Martin's children, to a slave trader who would take them to the frightful Deep South, the dreadful Deep South where the cotton fields were, and he was going to be going to Georgia. John Seller was about 7 years old at this time. Now I'm reading from his autobiography. "Mother has often told me of the heartbreaking scene, a long row of men chained 2 and 2 together called a coffle, and numbering about 30 persons. They were the first to march forth from the pen, the slave pen. Then came the quiet slaves, that is, those who were tame in spirit and degraded. Then came the unmarried women, or those without children. After these came the children who were able to walk, and following them came mothers with infants and young children in their arms. This gang of slaves were in traveling order, all being on foot except the children that were too young to walk and too old to be carried in arms. So remember, they're going from Charlotte, North Carolina to Georgia. These latter were put into a wagon, the children that were too old to be carried in arms. But mothers with infants had to carry them in their arms, and their blood often stained the whip. From when they were exhausted, they lagged behind. When the order was given to march, it was always on such occasions accompanied by the command, which the slaves were made to understand before they left the pen, to strike up lively. And they were made to sing a coffle song, to look as if they were fine, as if they were happy. John Sella states that it took them 7 weeks during the coldest weather to arrive in Columbus, Georgia. John Sella recounts of his mother's experience in the slaveholding area. But when she had spent a short time in the city pen in Columbus, she was sickened to the heart by the systemic falsehoods which the trader made the slaves tell to those who came to purchase them, by the vice which was inseparable from crowding men and women together, and by the terrible cruelty which the trader practiced upon those who would not give up their virtue and honor at his bidding. Mercy for Winifred and her children, it was evident because they were sold together. Many times families were split up, but providentially they were kept together as a family this time. Tragically, they were still bought as property by an enslaver, a Dr. Chipley and his family. They were with Dr. Chipley and his family for 3 years. After 3 years, because he had a debt that he had to settle, he ended up separating John Sella, his mother, and his sister, and selling them each to separate enslavers. For the first time in John Sella's life, he was without a mother or a friend who could help him. He came to the bitter realization that he was a slave for life. Still a young boy, this loss, he says, produced in him sympathy for my suffering fellow bondsmen and hatred of the system that oppressed us. His new enslaver was Mr. Powers. He was with Mr. Powers from age 10 to about age 18. So he grew up with this gentleman. John went from being a human fly swatter, that's how he started, to a valet, to an errand boy for gamblers that lived in the hotel where he resided with Mr. Powers. He learned from listening to the gamblers that there were colored people in some far off place that was called Canada and who were free. He listened to others reading, and he was awed that scribbles on a piece of paper could talk. He describes the quick and retentive memory he was blessed with allowed him to learn how to spell by sound before he ever saw a word with the alphabet. So he was very gifted, even from a young age. Through John Sella's association with white boys his age, he bartered with one boy named Eaton Bass to teach him to play marbles in exchange for teaching John to read. John Sella said that on the first day of his first lesson, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. He said the first day of his first lesson, he saw himself writing a pass to go and find his mother and sister, and then writing a pass to help lead them to freedom. So he had that dream. As he became more proficient in reading and writing, it awakened him the wildest hopes of freedom. And it also did that for other enslaved people because he would secretly read to them as well. When John Sella was about 17, he learned where his mother was. And he ran away to go and help her. With the help of another enslaved man, and after a tense and harrowing journey, he was in his mother's arms. It was a bittersweet time. 3 or 4 hours of converse followed, as sweet as mother and child indulged in, as it concerned the blessedness of reunion and the buoyancy of hope for freedom, and as bitter as was ever realized when it touched on the sufferings of a mother, torn from her children for no crime but the color of her skin, sufferings that owed at least their physical agony to the lash, which was put in use on account of, I know y'all are reading it too, her attempts to see her children or learn their fate. For my mother had run away 3 times to reach Columbus after she found out where I was, and each time had failed, paying for the failure with many drops of blood on her bare back, upon which I saw the terrible furrows made by the cowhide. John Sella begged his mother to run away with him. Winifred was held in bondage by a Mr. Terry, a truly evil man. About a month back, he had bought a proud slave named Flanders. Flanders always resisted the many enslavers that had bought him, and he had the scars on his back to prove it. Winnie relayed to John Sella that just that morning, because Terry thought that Flanders had disobeyed an order about grooming his horse, Terry had him tied to a crossbeam until the tips of his toes could just touch the ground. Terry himself gave Flanders 407 lashes. That I can't even get my head around that. Blood flowed at every stroke until it saturated the ground. Terry could see that Flanders was still defiant, so he continued to flog him until he became unconscious. The slaves watching said they thought that Flanders was dying. Terry thought he was playing possum and ordered him to be taken down. Terry stuck a knife in his Flanders' foot 2 or 3 times. Seeing that he didn't feel it, he said, "Yeah, he is dead. And let every one of you take warning by his fate, or I swear that I will kill every slave I own before I let one of them outdo me." This all happened early in the morning so that Terry, who was a licensed minister in the Presbyterian church, had time to dress, quiet his perturbed spirit, and to ride upon that same horse for the neglect of which he had taken the life of a human being. He rode 9 miles from his home to preach the gospel, the glorious gospel of the blessed God, to preach the glad tidings of him who came to open the prison doors to the captive, bind up the brokenhearted, and to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. His servant who waited on him at church told my mother when he got back that Terry, in the course of his sermon, said that that very day he had seen the punishment of a wicked temper. He had undertaken to give one of his slaves a light brushing, and he resisted. But when he found himself overpowered, he became too violent that he died in a fit of anger. Again, John Sella tried over and over to get his mother to leave with him. "I have borne a great deal in my life," she said, "so much that my spirit is crushed, and all courage is gone from me, and my body is worn out with the labor and the lash. It will not be long, therefore, before I shall be in a cold grave." She added with despair that crushed every hope of getting her to leave, "And God knows, my dear boy, I don't care how soon the time comes for me to lie there. There is no hope of our ever being together here on earth. And therefore, the sooner I start my journey to heaven, the sooner will my misery from our separation and from slavery cease." They heard footsteps coming. Terry had heard John Sella was there, and he came to Winnie's cabin. While John Sella was hiding, he heard Terry beating his mother with a stick. He came out to protect his mother, but finding her lying on the ground, Terry hit John Sella until he became unconscious. When he woke up and found himself tied, he heard that awful sound of the blows of a rawhide coming in contact with his mother's flesh, a sound that was always horrible to me, but which now seemed as if every blow had torn my own heart into pieces of quivering flesh. He had to lie there and listen to what he thought was his mother's dying goodbye to him. Thankfully, she did not die. John Sella was taken back to Powers, and he had him put in jail for 7 months for running away. While in jail, he met a fellow prisoner from the North, and he says, "Those 7 months were the most valuable months of his life. The man taught me grammar, history, arithmetic, geography. He told me also about the northern states and Canada, and he gave me the fullest instructions on how to reach them. And he informed me what was necessary for the undertaking. And when I did escape, it was by carrying out the instructions that I received from him." John Sella was now about 17 years old. Because Powers lost his sight, John's duty was to read to him. He read extensively, newspapers, novels, histories, the Bible. John Sella felt this gave him a general education. I think I advanced it too fast. I'm going to take that back. Okay. When John Sella was about 18 in 1850, Powers died. His will had freed John Sella. and the maid that he owned. But his heirs came down from the north, found a flaw, a legal flaw in the will, and had them both sold at auction. J. Sella writes it was the most humiliated that he had ever been. He was sold for 6,000 pounds English currency, which went to the Powers heirs. So who bought John Sella this time? Oh, yeah, that's it. Sella states, the result of this auction placed me in the hands of a colored man as his slave, a black man from Mobile, Alabama. In Sella's autobiography, this new enslaver is not named, so John Sella didn't even name him in the autobiography. But J. Sella says his time with him was short and he was soon sold again. He didn't give a whole lot of detail, but he says that because of his own rebellion, it caused him to be sold. That slavery had made him distrustful of the goodness of someone that shared his color. But now I learned something else tonight that we'll have to verify and talk about something different. I couldn't help but think that maybe this man might have given him his freedom because he had known how to do this. He had been a slave himself. I did some research and found out who this man was that bought John Sella. He is very well known in Southern history, especially in Alabama, because he was the architect and builder of many bridges and structures. Who knew? His enslaver paid him wages for work that he earned enough to buy his freedom. His name is Horace King, born in 1807. His bridges and structures survive to this day. That circular staircase is in one of the Alabama courthouses that he designed and built. Young Sella, now 19 years old, worked for 5 months on the Alabama River between Montgomery and Mobile for a slave trader named Wood. Because Wood knew J. Sella could read and write, but that he couldn't, Sella was made his unpaid secretary. He writes, John Sella writes, I saw sights of suffering and wrongdoing, the remembrance of which makes me shudder as I write. Frustrated by the uncertainties of authorities learning that he could read and write, or that his enslaver feared his escape, he firmed up his plan to run away north using his knowledge of southern cities and waterways. J. Sella's mother died in 1852. He never got to see her again, but a messenger brought her final words to him that he considered prophetic, and they were, tell my son he shall not wear out his days in slavery. I know that was very hopeful for him. John Sella Martin had been bought and sold at least 11 times. In his autobiography, he describes each enslaver and the difficulties that he encountered with each of them. But amazingly, he also talks about how he was able to use his circumstances to move closer to his dream and plan to gain his own freedom. Because he was so well-read and talented and intelligent, he was given jobs and he earned some money that he was able to keep. He eventually outwitted his last enslaver by applying a masterful scheme and forging freedom papers. And that's just an example of some freedom papers of one of the enslaved who was able to get her emancipation. He escaped on a boat that took him to Chicago, where on January 6, 1856, he declared himself to be a free man. It was 1856, and J. Sella was now 24 years old. The Fugitive Slave Act had just passed 6 years back, and this made his self-obtained freedom perilous. In Chicago, John Sella was encouraged to speak to audiences. Mary Ann Shadd of Buxton, Ontario, Canada, an editor of the Provincial Freeman, describes John Sella as exhibiting his eloquence and earnest appeals for the liberation of the slave. But by his own words, he was a terrible failure at public speaking. But he was compelled to do what he could for those whom he had left in prison in the house of bondage. He became an abolitionist lecturer, touring with his fellow fugitive slave, H. Ford Douglass. He made his way to Michigan through the Underground Railroad, and he connected with the Reverend James Soren Turretin Milligan of the Southfield Reformed Presbyterian Church, or the Covenanters Church, as it was commonly called. Reverend Milligan, who became the pastor in November 1853, was an acknowledged abolitionist, as were his parents before him. So let me ask, Does the Southfield Reformed Presbyterian Church sound familiar to anybody in here? Okay. Yes. Yes. It is the church that is right next door to where we are sitting right now. Yes. How many times have you walked by, driven, played tennis, volleyball, walked to the library? And that's where John Seller Martin found refuge from white enslaving bounty hunters. Okay, wow. Who knew? Here's another one. The Reverend James Soren T. Milligan owned a farm, and he lived on that farm right where Bernie Middle School sits today. Milligan describes in his memoirs, slave hunters often came clear to Detroit in pursuit of valuable slaves. J. Seller Martin, a slave from Alabama, was pursued to Chicago and then to Detroit, and a reward of $1,000 was offered for his capture. He was 6 weeks in my house and was the smartest man I have ever met. He afterward became a very eloquent Baptist minister in Boston. After his theological training under Reverend Milligan, John Seller traveled to Detroit, where he was baptized and ordained a minister by the Reverends William Troy and D.W. Anderson of Detroit's Second Baptist Church. Mm-hmm. I hear some. Let me make sure that I don't need to advance it. I'll just advance it and see. I'll give a sneak peek. Yep, that's it. Okay, very good. There was written that he had spent some time in Ontario, Canada, where there were many communities of formerly enslaved and free people of color that escaped and settled in Canada. Now,
Southfield Reformed Presbyterian Church.
That's right. That's right.
I'm Presbyterian.
All right, there you go. There's your connection right there. Okay, very good. Thank you for sharing that. We haven't been able to verify yet that he was in Canada. We're looking for records of that. If anybody knows that, share it with us. We'd love to be able to publish that too. Working hard to perfect his lectures in 1857, J. Seller began a lecture tour around Michigan. Sources describe 2 of his lectures, one in Coldwater and the other in Romeo. One editor called Seller Martin a prodigy, a natural orator, and one of the most interesting and forcible speakers of his age. In 1857, now age 25, Seller became pastor of Michigan Street Baptist Church in Buffalo, New York, his first job as a free man. He began his community organizing as well. A lot was happening with him. In 1858, he married Sarah Lattimore, a black woman of means whose father was also an abolitionist. She was originally from New York. Branching out, the Martins moved to Boston in 1859. J. Seller was invited to preach and even pastor in the largest Baptist church in Lawrence, Massachusetts, as well as temporarily filling in as the first black pastor at Tremont Temple in Boston, Massachusetts. He was now making a name for himself. He lectured on tour in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, lecturing on Nat Turner and the destiny of the Negro race in America. His mother had told him that he was born on the day that Nat Turner was hanged. J. Seller saw himself as a replacement of the martyr to continue his work, but in a different way. He became pastor of Joy Street Baptist Church of Boston, the first black Baptist church there. It was to become his base in the fight against slavery and discrimination. And if you see on the slide, it's now called the African Meeting House, and it's listed on the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. So feel free to go and visit there when you go there. John Brown supporters, both black and white, were meeting at Tremont Temple when an anti-slavery mob shut the meeting down. So J. Seller set up another meeting that night at his Joy Street church. The meeting was addressed by John Brown Jr. The mayor called out the militia and placed the police on full alert, but there was still violence and a number of black people were assaulted. This was 1860. Meetings were still continuing to be attempted. Mob attacks continued to disrupt them. On April 12th, 1861, I never knew dates were important when I was in school, but they're important. I've learned that. On April 12, 1861, firing on Fort Sumter began the Civil War. J. Seller and his colleagues continued to battle, now for the rights of blacks to fight in the war against the South. It was a challenging time for him. He had been suffering from painful urinary infections. and his first son had died in infancy. In August of 1861, John Sella, who was now an agent for the American Missionary Association, sailed for London. While in Britain, he suffered repeated attacks of his illness, but his mission was to get British abolitionists to support the North in the war and the fight against slavery. Although Britain had abolished slavery in 1807 on the continent and 1834 in its colonies, Britain had taken a position of neutrality on the Civil War. Jay Sella worked to a state of exhaustion to change their view and support the North in the war. British abolition leaders did not believe Jay Sella that Lincoln intended to emancipate the slaves. Despite suffering from illness and pain, he had to push that message that the North, the federal government, was anti-slavery. With great pushback, this man, free from slavery for only 5 years, who had taught himself to read and write as a child, read every book he could get his hands on as a teen, and practiced his oratorial skills as a young man, was now fighting with all his might to get the support of a nation. At one meeting, he stated, what really mattered was the fact that the North was at war with slaveholders and therefore should be supported by all those who considered themselves abolitionists. This didn't work. So he turned his tactics to speaking on his personal experience as a slave. Less controversial, this moved beyond measures, audiences all over England. He had seared the conscience of the British people. The Boston Traveler wrote that Martin's short stay had contributed immensely to the Union cause. One British pastor that heard Jay Sella speak about his sister Caroline and her 2 children that still being enslaved encouraged him and helped him to raise money to buy their freedom. Even the poor sacrificed and gave their pennies toward the cause, which was a lot of money to people 150 years ago, of pennies. He returned home the following year with $2,500 to buy his sister's freedom. Caroline's enslaver, John Dorson of Columbus, Georgia, he didn't want to sell her to Sella, citing, say that 5 times fast. Caroline was a Christian, so this is what the enslaver said. I don't want to sell her because Caroline was a Christian, a faithful servant, and should not be exposed to Boston, that den of social monsters and abolition infidels where madmen and creators of sedition like you and Wendell Phillips live. Dorson would not sell them to Jay Sella. Instead, he agreed to sell the 3 to slave traders on their way to Kentucky, understanding that Jay Sella would be given the opportunity to buy his family. Jay Sella went to Cincinnati, Ohio, a free city, and the exchange was made in Kentucky between the slave traders and some friends of Martin, some white friends of Martin. Jay Sella had been separated from his sister for over 20 years. They had an emotional reunion in Ohio on the other side of the river from the slave state of Kentucky, which is like looking from Detroit to Windsor. Jay Sella settled them in Dowagiac, Michigan, with some friends. It's now 1862, thank you. And back in Boston, John Sella wrote President Lincoln a letter to offer his services to write, to preach, and to fight. This is the letter, and he also included his portrait, and these are archived in the Lincoln Papers. Jay Sella and Frederick Douglass, they were friends, among others, saw Congress pass the D.C. Emancipation Act on April 16, 1862. This was essentially the Juneteenth for Washington, D.C. This act freed slaves in D.C. immediately, offered the newly freed $100 for voluntarily leaving the United States. Who knew? And paid $300 to each enslaver that freed their people. So 930 former enslavers freed those in bondage, and almost 3,000 black people were freed in D.C. Emancipation Day was celebrated in the District of Columbia for many years with parades and speeches. January 1863 saw John Sella, his wife Sarah, and daughter Josie returning to Britain. Sella was now suffering from recurrent lung illnesses, but even with ill health, he rejoiced at the change in British sentiments that supported the North. 10,000 supporters attended the meeting of the Emancipation Society in England. But There were many loud voices in England that supported the South and argued that supporting the North would encourage slave insurrections following Lincoln's emancipation. So Jay Sella was back in the fray with just a few other American abolitionists and their British brothers fighting against this fear-mongering. The verbal battle about the South and the North waged on in Britain, while the armed one waged on here. Jay Sella traveled all over England and Scotland, giving speeches and lectures, collecting donations to send back for the cause, and making friends in high places. At a lecture when he came back home, he described something that no other American abolition experienced. After a brief visit to Scotland and through the kindness of friends, I made the acquaintance of the favorite chaplain of the Queen. I went to Balmoral and saw the Queen, who gave...
The library will close in 30 minutes. If you need to print out information, check out materials, get a library card, or call for a ride, please do so now.
I'll be done by then. I went to Balmoral and I saw the Queen, who gave no money for political reasons, although she spoke kind words about the freedmen. Colonel Phipps, her secretary, promised that if possible, something should be done. The Civil War ended April 9th, 1865. That same month, the American Missionary Association, to whom he had been appointed agent, sent him on his third and final trip to England, where he had successes and failures in securing funds for the newly freed people. He had more good fortune in Scotland, but at the same time, he suffered debilitating illnesses. We learned that it was malaria and respiratory illnesses. In 1 month, he was recovered and launching blistering attacks to those who sold racist views in Britain and lecturing to increase interest in the cause of freedom. By 1868, after great success for his cause in Geneva, Switzerland, the American Missionary Association called them home. Sarah had written to them saying her husband would not survive if he did not reduce his work hours. And Jay Sella himself described night traveling, which I had been compelled to do, has kept in constant germination the seeds of an old disease, malaria and its associated liver problems. One author describes, all evidence suggested that laudanum had been prescribed for a long time for pain, and that John Sella was now sadly addicted to the opioid. John Sella, Frederick Douglass, and others were now the pillars of Black leadership. Jay Sella continued his activities now in Washington, D.C. Getting ready to get this out. He lobbied in the halls of Congress. He had meetings with senators to promote the interests of Black Americans. Who knew? He attended the National Colored Convention and was elected to the executive board. He was active in promoting their motto, liberty, labor, enfranchisement, and education. And he argued for women's total participation. In March of 1869, the newly formed Colored Labor Union, which I didn't know about that either, they endorsed the New Era as their representative newspaper. Originally, Frederick Douglass was to be its editor and John Sella an associate editor. Douglass showed little interest in moving to Washington, D.C., and he had some concerns about the paper's finances. So this suspended plans temporarily. Jay Sella negotiated with Douglass until a compromise was reached. One source writes, Jay Sella's demands must have been accepted and Douglass's concerns put to rest because the first issue came out January 1870 with Martin as editor and Douglass as corresponding editor. I had no idea. I knew about Frederick Douglass and the New Era. Jay Sella retired from ministry while working full-time on the paper. But did he really slow down? No. He was actively dedicated to the passing of the 15th Amendment, which granted African Americans the freedom to vote. He was the principal speaker at a celebration in D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. But Martin and his wife were both struggling with their health. The traveling and the climate in the United Kingdom had taken its toll. John Sella was also struggling financially as he'd left the ministry and the American I'm getting tongue-tied, hold on. It's like when you're watching watching your cable TV and it does like this. For a number of reasons, the Martins moved south. They settled in New Orleans, but did Jay Sella rest? No. He continued speaking in black circles. He lectured often and with much praise at Straight College, now HBCU Dillard University, of which my mother is an alum. He met with leading black Republicans and wrote frequent articles in the newspaper, the Louisianian. Everybody say that, the Louisianian. As usual, he entered the fray, this time into Louisiana politics. He ended up smack dab in the middle of major disputes and divisions, both within black political circles and in the Republican Party itself, which at that time was the party with black people. The Republican Party was the party of free people. Sella was swept up into a political Louisiana swamp, pun intended. At one point, Jay Sella was deceived and he left the Republican Party for the Fusion Party. This caused a huge public rift with his friend Frederick Douglass and other black leaders too. It was even in the newspapers. Frederick Douglass was quoted as saying, "The colored citizen Jay Sella Martin of Louisiana, a Greeley Fusion candidate for the legislature, was a miserable," what did I do? Oh, okay. They're straight university, thank you. Yeah. Frederick was a miserable subterfuge for a colored man. Nearly every one of the committees associated with him are bitter rebels, Negro haters, and men who did all they could in the last election to deprive the black man of all political power in the state. The good news is Frederick Douglass and Jay Sella Martin mended their rift and eventually worked together again as Republicans in Washington, D.C., fighting for equity and equal rights for blacks. So the newspaper article is where he did join the party and then where he resigned from the party. And
1873, Detroit Free Press.
Yes, very good, yep. I tried to put as much Detroit in there as I could, but much Southfield, much Oakland County. John Sella, wait a minute, what did I do here? Okay. John Sella did go back to live in New Orleans, even after he went to Washington to hang out with Frederick Douglass to work for these things. He came back to New Orleans, and he got back into the middle of politics again. He was encouraged by the passing of the Civil Rights Act in March 1875. The Civil Rights Act in March 1875, which he had worked hard to bring about. Then, sorry, I'll let you look at that for a second. Then came absolute silence on Jay Sella Martin from that time until 1876. The biographer suggests there's evidence that he went briefly back to Boston, where his wife and daughter lived, after attending and speaking at a convention in Cincinnati, Ohio. At some point, he was back in New Orleans. It appears he had lost his job at the Treasury, and he never received a promised position as superintendent of public schools in New Orleans. There were no newspaper mentions of him, and speculation was that he had lost his friends after the Cincinnati Convention speech. On August 11, 1876, a servant found him in bed, breathing irregularly, a half-empty vial of laudanum next to his bed. He died soon after, despite attempts by doctors to save his life. Some evidence indicates he committed suicide. Others that knew him said he had become increasingly despondent due to continuous illness and failure to find a job. The Detroit Free Press published his obituary, as did many other city newspapers in Michigan, England, and Canada. At the young age of 43, and in just 20 years from escaping slavery and going to Chicago, John Sella Martin left his mark on not just African American history, but American and world history. This man accomplished a lion's share of achievement that benefited Black Americans and Americans over the last 147 years. He single-handedly kept British support alive for the Union and the cause of freedom for the enslaved. His contemporaries, like Frederick Douglass, deemed him one of the era's finest orators. One wrote, "He was the lion who roared from the West." We can all see he was driven to achieve. His biographer writes that his impatience may have been fueled by him thinking that his illness might one day stop him from reaching his goals. His friend Frederick Douglass was aware of this and tried to get Jay Sella to see a project through to the end. Douglass wrote to him in 1871 to plead that Jay Sella pull steadily in his present harness, means stay in your lane. In other words, stay in your lane. Two enemies burdened John Sella, impatience and a battle to relieve unending pain due to laudanum. Mr. Martin, this is a quote, Mr. Martin was a remarkable man of his race, a man of great natural ability and an eloquent and effective speaker. Reared as a slave, he made a man of himself and for the good he has done in the church when he was at his best. For the long years he had eloquently and earnestly labored for the advancement of his race. He is kindly remembered by the colored people of the United States. For the good he has done, and that was in him, for the good he has done and that was in him, he is mourned by his friends. From the New Orleans Republican, 16 August 1876. So tonight I share with you some highlights from the life of John Sella Martin. I hope that you were moved as much as I and my colleagues at the Birmingham Museum, as moved as we were by this giant, this lion of a man. My goal tonight was that the cloak of invisibility and silence over Jay Sella Martin would be flung off and that he would be brought fully into the light where his legacy to us can be seen and known and shared. Thank you. 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 Now I would like to thank my colleagues at the Birmingham Museum for helping me put this presentation together because I would not have been able to do it without their help. You met Leslie Pilak, our director of the museum tonight, but I'd also like to introduce you to my colleague, Donna Casaselli, who is the archivist at the museum. Would you stand, Donna? Let's give her a hand. And I would also like to thank you for being an attentive audience and looking at these slides and pointing stuff out and saying who knew. That made things very interactive for us. So I want to thank you very much. Appreciate you. So, who knew? You are welcome to come to the museum in Birmingham. It's on Maple and Southfield Road, and it's open Monday through Saturday from 1 to 4 p.m. And we have much more of an exhibit there for you to see. Okay, so we know now. Thank you.